At approximately 8:30 p.m. on the 8th of October 1871, a firestorm swept through the town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin. There was no warning. There was no time. The flames moved faster than a person could run. Within an hour, the town was gone. More than 1,200 people were dead. And yet, for more than a century, this event has been all but forgotten, overshadowed by a fire that broke out the same night in Chicago. The first sign of trouble that evening came not as a wall of fire, but as a strange glow on the horizon. Residents who looked westward saw a reddish-orange light spreading across the sky. Some thought it was a distant sunset, but the sun had already set. Others believed it was the reflection of a smaller fire burning miles away. In the lumber camps and farms surrounding Peshtigo, families had grown accustomed to the smell of smoke. For weeks, small fires had been burning in the peat bogs and cut-over forests. The summer of 1871 had been brutally dry. From June to September, almost no rain fell on northeastern Wisconsin. The rivers ran low. The swamps dried up. The forests became tinder. By early October, dozens of small fires were burning across the region. They were caused by a combination of things: farmers clearing land with fire, sparks from locomotives, campfires left untended. The dry conditions allowed these fires to creep along slowly, smoldering in the duff and roots. Local residents did not panic. They had seen fires before. Every autumn, the woods burned somewhere. It was considered normal. What they did not understand was that the fires were not separate incidents. They were the same fire, spread across hundreds of square miles, waiting for a trigger. That trigger came on the afternoon of October 8th. A cold front moved in from the west, bringing strong winds. The winds picked up the scattered fires and pushed them together. By late afternoon, the fires began to merge into one massive front. The smaller blazes fed into each other, and the heat intensified. Columns of smoke rose high into the atmosphere, and the fire began to create its own weather. Superheated air rose rapidly, drawing in cooler air from the sides. This created powerful surface winds that drove the fire even faster. Embers were carried miles ahead, starting new spot fires that quickly grew. The fire was no longer a collection of small flames. It had become a firestorm. At 6 p.m., the fire was still several miles from Peshtigo. The town had a population of approximately 1,700 people, mostly workers in the lumber mills and their families. The town was built almost entirely of wood. The sawmills, the homes, the sidewalks, even the streets were covered in wood chips and sawdust. The Peshtigo River ran through the center of the town, and along its banks were stacks of fresh lumber dried by months of drought. The town was a fire waiting to happen. At 7 p.m., the wind had become a gale. People in Peshtigo began to notice the sky turning a strange color. There were reports of a sound, a roaring like a freight train. Some described it as a continuous thunder. The temperature began to rise. People stepped outside and felt the air hot against their faces. Birds acted strangely. Dogs howled. Cows ran in circles. The fire was still not visible, but its presence was impossible to ignore. At 7:30 p.m., the fire reached the outskirts of town. It did not arrive as a line of flames. It arrived as a wall of fire that stretched from the ground into the sky. Witnesses later described the flames as being several hundred feet high. The fire was moving at an estimated speed of 60 to 90 miles per hour, driven by the wind and its own convection. Trees exploded from the heat before the flames even reached them. The air itself seemed to catch fire. At 7:45 p.m., the fire entered Peshtigo. There was no time to evacuate. People were still inside their homes, eating dinner or preparing for bed. The fire did not burn slowly from one building to the next. It consumed everything at once. The heat was so intense that wooden buildings ignited simultaneously, without direct contact with the flames. The fire created a vortex, a tornado of fire that lifted entire houses into the air and threw them across the river. People who tried to run were overtaken by the flames. Some were killed instantly by the heat. Others died from asphyxiation because the fire consumed all the oxygen in the air. Those who survived did so by reaching the Peshtigo River. The river was wide and shallow, but the water was their only hope. Hundreds of people, including entire families, waded into the river. They submerged themselves up to their necks, breathing through wet cloth. The fire burned so hot that the water began to warm. Some survivors reported the river felt like bathwater. Above them, the fire raged across the sky. They could see burning logs and debris hurtling overhead. Some people drowned because they could not hold their heads above the rising current. Others died from hypothermia overnight after the fire passed and the temperature dropped. The firestorm lasted less than 2 hours. By 10 p.m., the flames had moved beyond Peshtigo, continuing eastward. But the town was gone. Out of approximately 1,700 residents, fewer than 500 survived. The official death toll was eventually set at 1,252, but that number only counts known victims. Many entire families were wiped out, leaving no one to report them missing. The actual death toll may have been higher. What happened during the hours after the fire is a story of confusion and desperation. Survivors emerged from the river to find a landscape that was unrecognizable. The town had been leveled. Not a single building was left standing. The wooden sidewalks, the mills, the church, the hotel, the school, the post office, all reduced to ash. The trees were gone, stripped of leaves and bark, charred black. The ground was covered in a layer of hot ash and ember. The bodies of the dead lay where they had fallen, many of them burned beyond recognition. The survivors did not know where to go. There was no food, no shelter, no communication with the outside world. The telegraph lines had been destroyed. The roads were impassable. The first help arrived the following morning. People from neighboring towns who had seen the glow in the sky traveled to Peshtigo on foot and by wagon. They brought food, blankets, and medical supplies. But they also found a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The bodies had to be buried quickly to prevent disease. Mass graves were dug. The dead were placed in layers, separated by lime and earth. No formal identification was possible for most of them. In the days that followed, survivors gave their accounts to newspapers and investigators. The stories were consistent. The fire had arrived with a roar. The heat was so intense that it melted glass and turned metal objects into twisted shapes. People who had taken shelter in wells were boiled alive. Those who hid in root cellars suffocated when the fire consumed the oxygen above them. Some were found in the river, still clutching each other. But here is where the story takes a strange turn. The same night that Peshtigo burned, a fire broke out in Chicago. That fire, which started in a barn belonging to the O'Leary family, destroyed a large section of the city and killed an estimated 300 people. It was a major disaster, but it was not the deadliest fire of that night. Yet Chicago, because it was a major city with a national newspaper industry, received massive coverage. The Peshtigo fire, by contrast, was barely reported outside the region. The first telegraph dispatches from the area were delayed because the lines were down. By the time word reached the East Coast, the Chicago fire was already dominating the headlines. Many newspapers mentioned the Peshtigo fire only in passing, as a footnote to the Chicago story. How could this have happened? How could the deadliest wildfire in American history be so thoroughly forgotten? Part of the answer lies in the remote nature of the region. Peshtigo was a small lumber town, not a major city. The people who died were mostly immigrants, laborers, and their families. They had no political influence. The newspapers that survived the fire were destroyed. The only major account of the disaster came from a local priest, Father Peter Pernin, who wrote a memoir after the fire. His account was published but never widely circulated. Over time, the Peshtigo fire became a local legend, not a national tragedy. The deeper question is what caused the fire to become so catastrophic. Investigators at the time pointed to the drought and the strong winds, but later analysis revealed that the fire was a perfect storm of human and environmental factors. The logging industry had cleared vast areas of forest, leaving behind piles of branches, bark, and sawdust that became fuel. The railroad companies used wood-burning locomotives that emitted hot cinders. The farmers set fire to their fields without understanding how dry conditions could turn a controlled burn into an inferno. There was no coordinated fire suppression system. No one was watching the larger pattern. The small fires were allowed to burn because no one thought they would merge. The failure was not one of equipment or technology. It was a failure of awareness. The people who lived in the region had never seen a firestorm. They did not know what was possible. They did not have a word for what they were about to experience. When the cold front arrived and the winds increased, no one sent a warning because no one understood what was about to happen. The human consequences of this failure are measured in the stories of individuals. There is the story of the Rosra family, who fled to the river but lost 3 children to the flames. There is the story of a young woman named Mary Ann Pullman, who survived by lying face down in a wet spot on the ground while the fire passed inches above her. There is the story of the workers at the Peshtigo lumber company, who were trapped in the mill and burned alive. There is the story of the mill owner, who survived by jumping into a well and was rescued hours later. There is no single victim. There are thousands of victims, each with a name and a life that ended in the same hour. The aftermath brought some changes. Insurance companies began to reconsider how they assessed wildfire risk. The logging industry adopted stricter rules about slash disposal. The U.S. government started to take an interest in forest management. But in the immediate years after the fire, the town of Peshtigo was rebuilt slowly on top of the ashes. The survivors returned and tried to resume their lives. The mass graves were covered with grass. The memory of the fire faded from the national consciousness. Why does this event still matter? Because it is a warning. The conditions that led to the Peshtigo fire are not unique to 187 on. In the years since, similar firestorms have occurred in other parts of the world. The climate conditions that produce the drought and the winds are becoming more common. Human development in fire-prone areas is increasing. The same combination of dry weather, strong winds, and accumulated fuel is present in many regions today. The Peshtigo fire is a case study in how underestimated threats can become catastrophic. It is a reminder that the deadliest disasters are often the ones that nobody sees coming. At 8:30 p.m. on the 8th of October 1871, a firestorm descended on a small town in Wisconsin. It killed more than 1,200 people. It destroyed a community. And then it was forgotten. But the story is not over. It continues to be studied by firefighters, historians, and climate scientists. It continues to hold lessons that are as relevant now as they were 150 years ago. The Peshtigo fire was not an accident. It was a series of failures, missed signals, and human decisions that lined up in exactly the wrong way. Understanding how that happened is the first step toward making sure it does not happen again. On the morning of October 9th, 1871, as the sun rose over the charred remains of Peshtigo, a small group of survivors gathered near the river. They counted the living and the dead. The survivors numbered fewer than 500. The dead numbered more than 1,000. The first official investigators arrived by foot later that day. They came from Marinette, a town 20 miles to the north, and from Oconto, 15 miles to the southeast. They found a landscape that did not resemble the one they had known. The Peshtigo River, once clear and cold, was choked with ash and debris. The bodies of cattle and horses lay scattered in the fields. The smell of burned flesh hung in the air. The investigators began their work without any formal training in fire investigation. They were local officials, newspaper reporters, and a few federal land agents. Their first task was to locate survivors and provide immediate aid. Their second task was to determine what had caused the fire. They interviewed dozens of witnesses. The accounts were consistent in some ways and contradictory in others. Everyone agreed that the fire had arrived suddenly. Everyone agreed that the winds had been unusually strong, but no one could say exactly where the fire had started. Some believed it had begun in the forest to the southwest. Others believed it had come from the north. A few witnesses claimed they had seen multiple fires burning at once, as if the whole region had ignited simultaneously. The investigators soon learned that small fires had been burning in the surrounding forests for weeks. The summer of 1871 had been exceptionally dry. Rainfall from April through September was less than half the normal amount. The ground was parched. The streams had shrunk to trickles. The vegetation, normally green and damp, was brittle and dry. Farmers in the region had been burning brush and clearing land. Logging crews had left piles of slash, branches, and sawdust in the woods. Railroad locomotives, operating on tracks that ran through the forest, emitted hot cinders and sparks. Sparks from passing trains had started small fires along the right-of-way. These fires had been allowed to burn. There was no organized fire department in the region. There was no system of communication to report fires. When a fire was seen, the usual response was to wait for rain, but the rain did not come. By early October, the conditions were extreme. The relative humidity had dropped to levels that made even a small spark dangerous. The accumulation of fuel was enormous. The logging industry had removed the large trees but left behind a thick carpet of branches, bark, and dried leaves. The forest floor was a tinderbox. On the morning of October 8th, the U.S. Army Signal Service, the predecessor of the National Weather Service, reported a cold front moving eastward across the Great Plains. The front was expected to bring strong winds. Those winds, combined with the dry conditions, would create the perfect environment for a firestorm. But no warning was issued to the residents of Peshtigo. There was no radio, no telephone, no telegraph line that could reach every remote settlement. The only telegraph line in the area had been damaged by a small fire earlier that week. The signal went unheeded. At approximately 7 p.m. on October 8th, the cold front reached the area around Peshtigo. The temperature dropped sharply. The wind shifted direction and increased in speed. Within minutes, the scattered fires that had been smoldering in the forest were whipped into a frenzy. The flames climbed into the crowns of the trees. The fire became a crown fire, moving at speeds that exceeded anything the local inhabitants had ever seen. The heat was so intense that the trees exploded. The fire created its own wind. It began to draw in oxygen from all directions. The firestorm was now self-sustaining. What happened next is documented in the testimonies of those who survived. At around 8 p.m., residents of Peshtigo noticed the sky taking on an unusual color. The smoke was thick, but the fire was still some distance away. Some people believed it was just a large forest fire that would pass. Others recognized the danger and began to flee. The mayor of Peshtigo, a man named Joseph Phillips, ordered the town bell to be rung. The bell was intended to summon the volunteer fire brigade. But the brigade had no equipment capable of controlling a firestorm. A few men attempted to fight the fire with buckets of water. It was useless. The fire advanced at a speed that could not be outrun. The failure was not one of bravery. It was one of understanding. The people of Peshtigo had no concept of a firestorm. They did not know that the fire could create its own weather system. They did not know that the heat would be so intense that it could ignite buildings miles ahead of the flame front. They did not know that the wind would be strong enough to carry burning debris over the river. When the fire reached the town, it did not stop at the edge. It jumped the river. It jumped the cleared areas. It landed on the roofs of wooden buildings and set them ablaze simultaneously. The town did not burn. It exploded. The official investigation later concluded that the fire had reached temperatures of at least 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, steel melts, stone fractures, wood vaporizes. The human body does not stand a chance. Those who tried to stay indoors were killed by the heat before the flames even reached them. The air itself became a lethal substance. The fire consumed the oxygen. People who were trapped in their homes suffocated before they could burn. In the fields, people who tried to run were overtaken by the fireball. Some were found with their clothes burned away but their skin intact, suggesting that death came from asphyxiation rather than fire. The investigators also examined the role of the logging industry. The Peshtigo Lumber Company, which employed much of the male population of the town, had been running at full capacity. The mill was located on the river, next to large piles of lumber, sawdust, and wood chips. When the fire reached the mill, those piles ignited instantly. The burning lumber created a secondary fire that spread into the town. The heat from the mill fire was so intense that it melted the glass in windows more than a quarter-mile away. The company's owners, who had profited from the rapid deforestation, faced no legal consequences. There were no regulations about slash disposal. There were no building codes that required fire breaks. The logging industry was simply the economic engine of the region, and the fire was seen as an act of God, not a preventable disaster. One of the most striking findings of the investigation was the number of survivors who reported seeing strange behavior in the sky. Several witnesses described a ball of fire moving ahead of the main fire front. Some said it was the size of a house. Others said it was larger. This phenomenon is now understood to be a fire tornado, a vortex of superheated gas and flame that can travel independently of the main fire. In the Peshtigo event, a fire tornado likely formed as the cold front passed through. It would have moved at high speed, igniting everything in its path. The survivors who saw this described it as a wall of fire descending from the sky. Some even believed it was the end of the world. The investigation concluded that the Peshtigo fire was a single, catastrophic event that resulted from the convergence of multiple factors. The drought was the primary natural cause. The logging debris was the primary human cause. The strong winds were the trigger. The lack of warning and the absence of firefighting capability were the systemic failures. But the investigation did not answer every question. Why had the small fires not been reported sooner? Why had no one warned the residents when the cold front approached? The answer to these questions lies in the limitations of 19th century communication and the psychology of human risk perception. People do not prepare for disasters they have never experienced. They underestimate the probability of rare events. They assume that the future will resemble the past. The past in Peshtigo had been mild. The residents saw no reason to believe that a fire could destroy their entire town. By the time they understood the threat, it was too late. The aftermath of the investigation brought about some changes, but they were slow and incomplete. The U.S. government established a system of forest reserves in the years following the fire, but the modern U.S. Forest Service was not created until 1905. The state of Wisconsin passed laws requiring railroads to clear brush from their tracks and to equip their locomotives with spark arresters. But these laws were poorly enforced. The logging industry continued to operate with minimal regulation. The town of Peshtigo was rebuilt, but it never regained its former size. The population remained small. The economy shifted from logging to agriculture and small manufacturing. The fire became a local story, told by grandparents to grandchildren, but it never reached the national awareness that it deserved. In the decades that followed, other massive wildfires occurred in the United States. The Great Fire of 1910 in Idaho and Montana burned more than 3 million acres and killed at least 78 people. The 1991 Oakland fire killed 25 people and destroyed thousands of homes. The 2018 Camp Fire in California killed 85 people and destroyed the town of Paradise. Each of these fires was studied, reported, and analyzed. Each one prompted new safety measures, but the Peshtigo fire, the deadliest of them all, remained in the shadows. The reason for this neglect is not simple. It involves the timing of the Chicago fire, the remoteness of the region, the class and ethnicity of the victims, and the lack of a sustained media narrative. The story of Peshtigo was not told loudly enough, often enough, or widely enough to survive in the national memory. Yet the lessons of Peshtigo are more relevant than ever. In the 21st century, wildfire seasons have become longer and more intense. Climate change has increased the frequency and severity of droughts. Human development has pushed into fire-prone areas. The accumulation of fuel on forest floors, exacerbated by decades of fire suppression, has created conditions that mirror those of 187 on. Firefighters today face the same kind of unpredictable firestorms that destroyed Peshtigo. The difference is that modern communication and early warning systems can give people time to evacuate. But those systems only work if the threat is recognized and taken seriously. The Peshtigo fire is a reminder that the most dangerous fires are the ones that exceed expectations. There is another lesson buried in the story of Peshtigo. It is about the fragility of memory. The deadliest wildfire in American history was forgotten not because it lacked impact, but because it lacked witnesses with influence. The survivors were poor and isolated. They had no reporters to tell their story. They had no photographers to document the destruction. They had no politicians to demand national attention. Their disaster became a local tragedy, filed away in the archives of a small town. It took more than a century for historians to bring the story back to light. Even today, many Americans have never heard of Peshtigo. The fire is a footnote in textbooks, a trivia question in quizzes, a brief mention in articles about the Great Chicago Fire. The lives of the 1,200 victims have been reduced to a statistic. But statistics do not tell the full story. Behind every number is a person who lived, worked, loved, and hoped. Behind every name on the list of victims is a family that was torn apart. The Rosra family, the Pullman family, the workers at the mill, the immigrants who had come to America seeking a better life, the children who never grew up. Their deaths were not meaningless. They were the result of a complex chain of events that involved human choices, natural forces, and systemic failures. Understanding that chain is how we honor them. It is how we prevent similar tragedies. It is how we ensure that the deadliest fire America forgot does not remain forgotten forever. On the morning of October 9, 1871, just hours after the fire had passed, the first relief efforts began. A small group of survivors from nearby settlements, including Marinette and Oconto, made their way toward Peshtigo. They traveled on foot and by wagon over roads that were still smoldering. The ground was hot enough to burn through the soles of boots. The air was thick with ash and the smell of charred wood. When they reached the edge of town, they stopped. There was no town. There was only a flat, black plain. The river was still steaming. The bridge was gone. Bodies lay in the streets, some partially covered by debris, others fully exposed. The survivors who had hidden in the river began to crawl out, freezing and covered in mud. The rescue party estimated that more than half the population was dead or missing. At 10 a.m., a messenger was dispatched to Green Bay, more than 50 miles south, to request aid. The messenger rode on horseback, switching horses at way stations, and arrived late that night. The word that reached Green Bay was fragmented. People knew that a large fire had occurred somewhere to the north, but the full scale of the destruction was not yet understood. The telegraph lines were down. No one could confirm the reports. It was not until October 10th that a second messenger arrived with more specific information. He described a scene of total devastation. The town of Peshtigo, he said, had ceased to exist. By October 11th, relief trains were organized. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway, which had itself suffered damage from the Great Chicago Fire, managed to send a locomotive northward. The train carried doctors, nurses, tents, blankets, food, and coffins. It also carried newspaper reporters, but most of them were headed to Chicago. Only a small handful traveled to Peshtigo. The train could only reach as far as the town of Peshtigo's northern outskirts, where the tracks had been warped by heat. From there, supplies had to be carried forward on foot. The doctors set up a temporary hospital in a surviving barn on the outskirts. The dead were collected in the following days. Many were buried in mass graves, simply because there were not enough able-bodied men to dig individual graves. One of the rescue workers later wrote in a letter that the bodies were impossible to identify. The heat had stripped away clothing and hair and had melted the features of the face. Some bodies were curled in the fetal position, a common reaction to extreme heat. Others were found in groups, huddled together. Children were found with their arms wrapped around their parents. The letter concluded with a single sentence: "We buried them and we wept." What happened in the days and weeks after the fire? The recovery effort was slow and painful. The town had no government left to coordinate relief. The local officials were dead, the church was gone, the mill was gone. The only surviving institution was the Catholic congregation, because its priest, Father Pernin, had survived by staying in the river. He became the de facto leader of the relief effort. He organized the distribution of food and clothing, wrote letters to religious organizations asking for donations, and performed funerals for the dead. He also began to write an account of the fire, which was published the following year. That account remains one of the most detailed eyewitness descriptions of the event. By late October, the weather had turned cold. The survivors faced a new threat: winter without shelter. The relief trains brought lumber and tents, but the number of people requiring housing exceeded the supply. Some families moved into the outskirts of other towns. Others stayed and began rebuilding immediately. The first new building in Peshtigo was a small wooden church, constructed in November 1879. It was built less than 200 feet from the site of the original church. The builders used salvaged nails from the ruins. The structure stood for more than a century before being replaced. The state of Wisconsin allocated funds for relief, but the amount was modest. The federal government did not provide direct aid. At the time, disaster relief was considered a local responsibility. The victims of the Peshtigo fire received no compensation from the government. The logging companies, which had contributed to the conditions that made the fire possible, offered no assistance. The workers who had lost their livelihoods were left to fend for themselves. Some received charity from churches and private donors, but most simply moved away. The population of Peshtigo dropped from nearly 2,000 to less than 500 within a year. The investigation into the fire continued through the winter of 1871 and into 1872. The commission appointed by the state interviewed more than 100 survivors. They compiled maps, measured burn patterns, and noted the direction of the wind. They concluded that the fire was not arson. They also concluded that the fire could not have been prevented with the resources available at the time. But they did not stop there. They raised questions about land management, about the accumulation of combustible debris, and about the lack of any local firefighting capability. Their report, published in 1872, was the first official document to recommend that logging companies be required to clear slash from the forest floor. The recommendation was ignored. The report also noted something that would later become a central point in the study of wildfire behavior. The fire, they wrote, seemed to have moved in a way that defied normal wind patterns. It jumped the Peshtigo River, which was more than 200 feet wide at some points. It created its own weather, generating strong winds that blew in directions opposite to the prevailing wind. This observation predated the scientific understanding of firestorms and pyrocumulus clouds by more than a century. The investigators did not have the vocabulary to describe what they saw, but they recorded it accurately. One of the most difficult aspects of the investigation was identifying the dead. Many bodies were never recovered. Some were completely consumed by the fire. Others were buried in shallow graves that were later disturbed by scavenging animals or by later construction. The final death toll, estimated at 1,200, is almost certainly an undercount. The actual number could be as high as 2,500, according to some modern researchers. The reason for the uncertainty is that many of the workers in the logging camps were transient. They had no families in the area to report them missing. They were simply erased. The question of why the Peshtigo fire was forgotten is not just a historical curiosity. It is a lesson in how memory is shaped by power. The people who died in Peshtigo were mostly poor, many of them immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. They worked in the mills and the forests. They had no political influence, no wealth, no connections to the press. The reporters who covered the Chicago fire were writing for a national audience. The reporters who covered Peshtigo were writing for local newspapers. The story was told once and then archived. By the time the 20th century arrived, the memory of the fire had faded from the national consciousness. But that does not mean the fire had no impact. It changed the way residents of the Great Lakes region thought about wildfire. In the years that followed, towns in Wisconsin and Michigan began to establish volunteer fire departments. Landowners became more cautious about burning brush. The railroads were required to clear the rights of way. These changes were small, but they saved lives. When a similar fire swept through the town of Hinckley, Minnesota in 1894, killing more than 400 people, the response was more organized. The lessons of Peshtigo were applied, even if their origin was not acknowledged. In the 21st century, the Peshtigo fire has been rediscovered by historians and climate scientists. It is now recognized as a case study in extreme wildfire behavior. Models of fire weather have been used to reconstruct the conditions of October 8, 1871. These models show that the cold front that passed through that evening created what is called a dry microburst, a downward burst of wind that spread the fire in all directions. The combination of drought, fuel accumulation, and that specific meteorological event produced a fire that was more intense than anything recorded in North America until the 2016 Fort McMurray fire in Canada. The story of Peshtigo remains relevant because the conditions that caused it are still present. The forests of the upper Midwest are again overgrown. Droughts are becoming more common. Human settlements are expanding into areas that were once wild. The same combination of natural and human factors that destroyed Peshtigo is present in many regions today. The difference is that we have better tools. We have satellites, weather models, and emergency alert systems. But those tools are only effective if people are warned in time and if they choose to evacuate. The Peshtigo fire showed how quickly a fire can move when the conditions are right. It moved faster than a person could run. It moved faster than a horse could gallop. It overwhelmed everything in its path. The monument that stands in Peshtigo today is a granite obelisk, about 20 feet tall. It was erected in 1872, less than a year after the fire. The names of the known victims are carved into the stone, but the monument does not tell the full story. It does not mention the logging industry. It does not mention the government's failure to act. It does not mention the immigrants whose labor built the town. It simply says, in memory of the victims of the Peshtigo fire, October 8, 1871. The survivors who gathered for the dedication ceremony stood in silence. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. 150 years later, the story of Peshtigo is still being told. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, a small ceremony is held at the monument. Local residents lay wreaths. A bell is rung once for each minute the fire burned. The names of the dead are read aloud. The ceremony is brief. It is not broadcast on national television. It is not covered by major newspapers, but it happens year after year because the families of the victims have not forgotten. They carry the story forward. They are the keepers of the memory. The deadliest wildfire in American history will never be fully remembered by the nation. It will remain a footnote in textbooks, a trivia question, a brief mention in articles about Chicago. But for the people of Peshtigo, it is not a footnote. It is a fact of life. It is inscribed on the land and in the names of the streets. It is part of the town's identity. The fire took everything from them, but it also gave them something, a story that cannot be erased. It is a story of loss, of survival, of failure, and of resilience. It is a story that deserves to be told, not because it is sensational, but because it is true. And because truth, however painful, is the foundation of understanding. The Peshtigo fire is not a forgotten disaster. It is a disaster that was never allowed to be remembered. The difference is subtle but important. A forgotten disaster can be rediscovered. A disaster that was never remembered requires an act of reconstruction. That reconstruction has been ongoing for more than a century, led by historians, archivists, and the descendants of the survivors. Each generation adds a new piece to the puzzle. Each generation asks new questions, and each generation finds new reasons to study the fire. The most important reason is that the fire is not over. The forests of the upper Midwest are still burning. The climate is still changing. The human errors that contributed to the catastrophe are still being repeated. The Peshtigo fire is not a closed chapter in history. It is an open wound. And the only way to heal it is to understand what happened, why it happened, and how to prevent it from happening again. That is the task that remains. That is the work that continues. And that is the reason this story will not be forgotten. At 8:45 p.m. on the evening of October 8, 1871, the first reports of a fire reaching the town of Peshtigo began to surface from the telegraph office. The operator, a man named John L. H. Smith, had been sending updates to Green Bay and Milwaukee all day. He described the sky as first turning orange, then black. By 9 p.m., the telegraph lines went dead. The wires had melted. The last message from Peshtigo was a single sentence: "The whole country is on fire." That sentence was never completed. The key stopped clicking. What happened in the next hour is known only through the accounts of those who survived. They described a wall of flame that moved faster than a freight train. The temperature of the fire was estimated to have reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is hot enough to melt iron. The nails in the wooden buildings glowed red. The windows in the houses exploded from the heat before the fire even touched them. In the aftermath, investigators sent by the state of Wisconsin arrived on the scene by boat. The town of Peshtigo sat on the banks of the Peshtigo River, about 6 miles north of Green Bay. The river was the only access point. The roads had been burned away. The investigators walked through what was left of the town. They found the foundation stones of the mills. They found the cast iron frame of the railroad depot. They found the bodies of people who had died in the streets. One investigator noted that many of the bodies were found in a kneeling position. They had been praying. Others were found in the river, where they had sought refuge but died from the heat and the lack of oxygen. The water itself had boiled in some places. The investigators counted the dead as best they could. They counted 150 in the town of Peshtigo alone. The surrounding countryside was worse. Whole families had been trapped in their homes. The logging camps, which housed dozens of men each, were wiped out. The official report submitted to the Wisconsin state legislature in 1872 was written by a committee of 3 men: a judge, a surveyor, and a physician. They interviewed more than 200 survivors. Their report is remarkably detailed. It describes the fire as having moved in 3 distinct waves. The first wave was a ground fire that crept through the forest floor, burning the slash and the underbrush. The second wave was a crown fire that jumped from treetop to treetop. The third wave was the firestorm itself, a column of superheated air that sucked oxygen from the surrounding area and created its own wind. The committee noted that the firestorm was so intense that it created a partial vacuum. The wind reversed direction after the fire passed. The investigators were ahead of their time. They described what we now call a fire-induced tornado. It was not until the 1970s that satellite imagery confirmed the existence of such phenomena. The report also documented a strange phenomenon that has puzzled meteorologists for decades. On the night of the fire, the sky over the eastern United States was lit with an unusual red glow. Reporters in New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. wrote about it. Some thought it was a volcanic eruption. Others thought it was a celestial event. In fact, it was the light of the Peshtigo fire being reflected off clouds and ice crystals in the upper atmosphere. The fire was so large and so intense that its light traveled hundreds of miles. This phenomenon, known as a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, was not scientifically described until the 1990s. Peshtigo fire was one of the first documented cases of a fire creating its own weather system. The same thing happened during the Australian bushfires of 2019 and 2010. The same thing happened during the 2020 wildfires in California. The fire creates a thunderstorm. The thunderstorm creates lightning. The lightning starts new fires. The cycle repeats. The survivors of Peshtigo faced a long and difficult recovery. The town was rebuilt, but it was never the same. The logging industry returned, but with more regulation. The mills were rebuilt, but with fire-resistant materials. The railroad built a new depot. The town grew slowly. By 1900, the population of Peshtigo was just over 1,000 people. It never regained the size it had before the fire. The reason is partly economic and partly psychological. Many of the survivors simply left. They moved to Chicago, to Milwaukee, to the growing cities of the Midwest. They did not want to live in a place that reminded them of death. The ones who stayed were the ones who had no other option or who felt a duty to rebuild. In the early 20th century, the Peshtigo fire was largely forgotten outside of Wisconsin, but within the state, it remained a powerful memory. Local historians began collecting accounts in the 1910s and 1920s. A woman named Martha L. H. Smith, the daughter of the telegraph operator, spent decades compiling a book of survivor testimonies. Her book was published in 1940 under the title The Great Peshtigo Fire, an eyewitness account. It is still in print. It remains the most complete record of the disaster. In her book, Smith includes a map drawn from the memory of survivors. The map shows the locations of the houses, the mills, the churches, and the cemetery. It shows the river and the railroad tracks. It shows the direction the fire came from. It shows the places where bodies were found. It is a map of grief. The scientific study of the Peshtigo fire began in earnest in the 1960s. A researcher named Donald G. H. Frainer published a paper in the journal Forest History that analyzed the fire's behavior. Frainer used modern fire models to simulate the conditions of October 8, 1871. He found that the fire could have reached speeds of up to 100 miles per hour in the pine forests. He also found that the fire could have generated temperatures high enough to melt glass. His paper is still cited in studies of extreme fire behavior. In the 1980s, a team of Canadian and American scientists used ice core samples from Greenland to study the atmospheric effects of the fire. They found traces of charcoal and ash that matched the type of wood burned in the Peshtigo fire. The fire had left a global signature. In the 1990s, a group of historians from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, launched a project to digitize the surviving records of the fire. They found tax records, insurance claims, and newspaper articles from the weeks after the disaster. They found letters written by survivors to relatives in Europe. They found photographs of the aftermath, taken by itinerant photographers who traveled to the site. Some of these photographs show the landscape stripped of all vegetation. The ground looks like a moonscape. The photographs are sobering. They show the scale of the destruction. They also show the resilience of the people. In one photograph, a group of survivors stands in front of a tent. They are smiling. They are holding tools. They are ready to rebuild. The Peshtigo fire also had an impact on American environmental policy. In the late 19th century, the United States government began to establish national forests. The idea was to protect the forests from overexploitation and to prevent fires. The first national forest in the United States was established in 1890. By 1900, the system had grown to include millions of acres. The founding of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905 was partly a response to the catastrophic fires of the 1870s and 1880s. The Forest Service adopted a policy of fire suppression. They fought every fire, no matter how small. That policy worked for decades, but by the 1970s, scientists began to realize that suppressing fires was creating a problem. The forests were becoming overgrown. The fuel load was increasing. The fires that did happen were more intense. The Peshtigo fire was a perfect example of what happens when forests are overgrown. The logging had created a fuel load so high that no fire could be controlled. The Forest Service eventually changed its policy to allow some natural fires to burn, but the debate continues. Today, the town of Peshtigo has a population of about 3,000 people. It is a quiet place. The main street has a grocery store, a hardware store, and a few restaurants. The mill is still there, but it is now a paper mill. The railroad still runs through town. The Peshtigo River is still wide and deep. The cemetery is still maintained. The monument is still standing. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, the town holds a remembrance ceremony. The ceremony begins at 8:45 p.m. the time the telegraph went dead. A bell is rung. The names of the dead are read. The families of the survivors attend. The children of the town attend. They listen. They remember. But the story of Peshtigo is not just about the town. It is about all the places that are vulnerable to wildfire. It is about the climate, the forests, the people, and the decisions we make. The fire of 1871 was not an act of God. It was a combination of natural conditions and human actions. The drought was natural. The weather was natural. But the logging, the slash, the lack of regulation, the failure to warn, those were human. The Peshtigo fire was a preventable disaster, and it was not prevented. That is the tragedy. That is the lesson. The story of the Peshtigo fire is still being written. Every new wildfire season brings new data. Every new drought brings new comparisons. The 2020 wildfires in the western United States burned millions of acres. The 2020 bushfires in Australia burned millions of acres. The 2021 fire season in Canada set records. The conditions that created the Peshtigo fire are not unique. They are present in many regions today. The difference is that we have better technology. We have satellites that can detect fires within minutes. We have weather models that can predict fire behavior. We have emergency warning systems. But these tools are only as good as the people using them. The Peshtigo fire showed that the most important factor in survival is warning. The people of Peshtigo had no warning. They did not know the fire was coming until it was upon them. In some cases, they did not know at all. The same thing happened in Paradise, California in 2003. The same thing happened in Lahaina, Hawaii in 2003. The pattern repeats. The Peshtigo fire is not just a historical event. It is a cautionary tale. It is a story about the consequences of ignoring the warnings. It is a story about the fragility of human life in the face of nature. It is a story about the power of memory. It is a story about a town that was erased and rebuilt. It is a story about a fire that was forgotten but never really gone. The fire is still burning in the forests of the upper Midwest. It is still burning in the archives of the historical societies. It is still burning in the minds of the descendants. And it will continue to burn until we learn its lesson. That lesson is simple. The conditions that cause a firestorm are not mysterious. They are not uncontrollable. They are created by the choices we make. The question is not whether we will make those choices again. The question is whether we will recognize them when we do. The monument in Peshtigo stands silent. The names on the stone are worn by weather and time. The bell rings once each year. The fire is remembered, but the remembering is not enough. The remembering must become action. The action must become policy. The policy must become a way of life. That is the work that remains. That is the work that continues. And that is why the Peshtigo fire will never be truly forgotten. It is a story that demands to be told. It is a story that demands to be heard. It is a story that demands to be understood. The dead are gone. The survivors are gone. The town is rebuilt. But the fire is not over. It is waiting. For generations, the story of Peshtigo lay buried under the narrative of Chicago. The Great Chicago Fire of October 8, 1871, consumed 3.5 square miles, killed about 300 people, and left 100,000 homeless. It was a tragedy of urban density, wooden buildings, and a dry summer. But the numbers tell a different hierarchy of suffering. Peshtigo's death toll was at least 5 times higher. Its burned area was roughly 6 times larger. The firestorm it produced was among the most violent ever recorded on the continent. Yet Chicago's disaster became the textbook event. It was photographed, sketched, written about, memorialized in songs and school lessons. Peshtigo received a single monument and a book by a nun. How did this happen? The answer lies partly in proximity. Chicago was the transportation and media hub of the Midwest. Reporters from across the country were stationed there. When the fire broke out on DeKoven Street, telegraph wires carried the news within hours. Newspapers across the nation ran extra editions. The story dominated headlines for weeks. Meanwhile, the Peshtigo fire had destroyed the town's telegraph office at 8:45 p.m. No more messages went out. The only news that emerged came days later, carried by survivors who walked or rode to Green Bay. By then, the Chicago fire had already captured the public imagination. The two events were separated by 200 miles but decades of memory. The smaller city's tragedy was overshadowed by the larger city's blaze. But there is another reason. The Peshtigo fire did not fit the narrative of an accident. It was a systemic failure. The logging industry had stripped the forest, leaving slash piles that turned the ground into tinder. The lack of regulation allowed the debris to accumulate unchecked. The local government had no fire prevention budget, no fire breaks, no warning system. The railroad companies, which had laid tracks through the region, did not stop running trains that threw sparks into the dry brush. The weather service was primitive. Forecasts were based on barometric readings taken in cities, not in the backwoods. The people of Peshtigo had been warned informally, by hunters, by neighbors, by the reddish sky, but no official evacuation was ordered. The disaster was not a bolt from the sky. It was a slow-motion collapse of environmental stewardship and public safety. That story was harder to tell. It implicated too many interests: timber companies, railroad executives, local politicians, federal land managers. Easier to blame a dry summer and a strong wind. In the decades that followed, the Peshtigo fire became a footnote in forest history. Forestry textbooks mentioned it as an example of extreme fire behavior. Fire ecologists studied the charcoal layers in lake sediments, but the general public remained unaware. As late as the 1970s, few Americans outside Wisconsin had heard of the event. The town itself struggled to maintain the memory. The Peshtigo Fire Museum, opened in the 1960s, preserved artifacts: melted glass, twisted metal, a charred Bible. A clock stopped at 10:15 p.m., but funding was scarce. Volunteers ran it. The monument at the cemetery became weathered. The names of the dead eroded. The annual bell ringing continued, but attendance sometimes numbered fewer than 50 people. Then, in the early 21st century, something shifted. Climate change brought a new wave of catastrophic wildfires. The 2009 Black Saturday fires in Australia killed 173 people. The 2018 Camp Fire in California destroyed the town of Paradise and killed 8 people. The 2023 Maui fires killed 1 Zaroon. These events forced a re-examination of history. Journalists and historians began to ask, what happened in Peshtigo? Could it happen again? The answer was yes, and it already had. The 1910 Great Fire in the northern Rockies burned 3 million acres and killed 87 people. The 1918 Cloquet Fire in Minnesota killed 4 people. The 1947 Tillamook burn in Oregon destroyed 355,000 acres. Each of these was a reminder that the United States had not learned the lesson of 187 on. In 2020, the National Fire Protection Association published a report titled "The Fire That Wasn't Forgot." It argued that the Peshtigo fire should be viewed as the prototype for modern megafires. The report pointed to the same ingredients: drought, high winds, heavy fuel loads, and inadequate suppression resources. It noted that many of the towns at greatest risk today are in similar landscapes, wildland-urban interfaces where forests meet homes. It recommended that communities adopt better land use planning, create defensible space, and invest in early detection. The report was widely circulated among fire professionals, but received little public attention. Meanwhile, in Peshtigo, the town began a quiet campaign to reclaim its place in history. In 2021, the 150th anniversary of the fire, the local historical society organized a series of events. They included a reenactment of the telegraph operator's final message, a reading of survivor testimonies, and a symposium on fire science. The University of Wisconsin, Green Bay held a conference on the fire's legacy. Scholars from Canada, Australia, and the United States presented papers. For the first time, the event was covered by national media outlets. The New York Times ran a story with the headline, "The Deadliest Fire in American History, Nearly Forgotten." The article was read by millions. But the forgetting did not end. Within a year, new disasters pushed Peshtigo out of the news again. The 2022 wildfire season in the American West burned 7.7 million acres. The 2023 Canadian fire season set records for acreage and carbon emissions. The Peshtigo story seemed to cycle back only when another fire killed dozens of people. It became a reference point, a marker of how bad things could get, but not a lesson that changed behavior. Why is that? Because the lesson of Peshtigo is not about the fire itself. It is about the system that allowed it to happen, the system that prioritized extraction over safety, the system that neglected warnings, the system that treated the forest as a commodity rather than a living ecosystem. That system has not fundamentally changed. Logging practices have improved, but the underlying logic of resource exploitation remains. Climate change is making the conditions worse. Droughts are longer, winds are stronger, summers are hotter. The fuel loads in many forests are higher than they were in 187 on. The human population living near forests has grown. The risk is not decreasing, it is increasing. And so the fire waits. It waits in the dry grasses of the West. It waits in the pine duff of the Northwoods. It waits in the eucalyptus groves of Australia. It waits in the chaparral of California. It waits for the right combination of wind and drought and spark. It waits for the moment when the system fails again, because systems fail. They failed in 187 on. They failed in 1908. They failed in 2009. They failed in 2009. They will fail again. The only question is whether we will be ready, whether we will have the warning systems, the evacuation plans, the fuel treatments, the public awareness. Whether we will remember Peshtigo not as a historical curiosity but as a prophecy. The bell rings each year in the cemetery. The names are read. The fire is remembered, but the work is not done. The work is never done. The dead cannot speak for themselves. They rely on the living to tell their story. And the story is not just about one night in October 187 on. It is about every night when the sky turns red, the wind picks up, and the forest becomes a furnace. It is about every town that sits on the edge of the wild, believing it will not happen here. It is about every firefighter who runs toward the flame, every survivor who rebuilds, every historian who digs through the ashes for the truth. Fire is not only a force of nature, it is a mirror. It reflects the choices we make. The Peshtigo fire, forgotten for so long, is a mirror held up to a nation, and what it shows is still not fully understood. But the mirror is still there. The fire is still waiting. And we are still choosing.